Okay, it's 11:03. I'd like to get started. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's session. Again, my name is Adam Goldstein, the Chief Business Officer for the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York, and I just have a few comments before we get started. As a response to the COVID crisis, we've created this webinar series to bring you educational content in the remote working environment. As always, we are continually looking to enhance the program. So if you wouldn't mind completing the survey, which will come up at the end of the webinar, we would appreciate that. We'll be sending out an email with the recording of the session, as well as the link to download the presentation at the conclusion of the webinar. Also, if you're interested in scheduling a one-on-one session on a particular topic, like an economic update from our in-house financial economist, or with Rachel Azuka, who will be speaking about the Libor transition, please let us know. Contact your relationship manager, and we'll set that up for you. We encourage you to visit our financial intelligence library, where you can see a podcast of today's topic from our expert Rachel Azuka and Tom Citino. Also various articles and recordings of past webinars and lots of good content. We also created that dedicated COVID-19 information page, which over 1,000 of you have visited, which we really appreciate. It has all the latest news about dividends, PPP as collateral, how we're helping with disaster relief funding. If you have not participated in that, we had about $3 million go out. I'm sorry, $5 million go out within a couple days. And just this week, we announced that we're doing another $3 million of funding to provide financing for small businesses in New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And that funding will be available on July 6th. So if you would like to participate in that, I can tell you that it goes out very, very quickly. So please let us know, and we'll get you in the program. That's up to $250,000 per member and up to $10,000 per small business. A lot more detail on that, but if you're interested in that, let us know. In addition, other grant programs that the bank provides to support housing and community economic development, our 2020 Homebuyer Dream Program. We put out $3 million for first-time home buyers. It was gone in 2 days. Over the next period, which will open up on July 1st, we're going to put out another $3 million. And again, these programs go pretty quickly. So if you want to know what's available to you as a member, please visit the website or contact your relationship manager. Throughout the summer, just as a heads up, because looking at the list of folks on the line today, I can see many of you have been on previous webinars. We just wanted to let you know that over the summer, we'll be transitioning to a bi-weekly schedule for these sessions. And are excited to announce a two-part series in partnership with the Parliament Consulting. Part 1 on July 9th will be on loan pricing, presented by Dr. Tom Parliament, and Part 2 will be on July 23rd will be on deposit pricing, which will be presented by Janet Lockwood. These are really timely topics about how to price during this environment that we're in. We've reviewed their material. We think it's very thought-provoking and encourage you to tune in for those webinars. We'll be sending you an invitation. But for now, I'd like to introduce Rachel Azuka, a good friend of mine and a good guy at the Home Loan Bank of New York. He's been at the bank for several years. Tom will provide an introduction. He's the Director of Capital Markets Research and the Head of Libor Transition. And Tom Citino, who I'm sure you all know, our Vice President, Director of Member Relations. We're going to walk us through today's topic, the Great Transition. So, Tom, will you take it away from here? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everybody. So today's topic of conversation is the Libor Transition. The title is Libor Transition, the Halftime Report. This is a real big undertaking for the Home Loan Bank. It's really a big issue for us at the Home Loan Bank of New York and also the whole Home Loan Bank system of 11 banks. Also, it's a very big issue for our members as well for a number of reasons. So let me just start. The Home Loan Bank is a very large issuer of both floating rate debt and also fixed rate debt issuances. So this is critical to our operations, also very important for our members for a couple of reasons. One, we're a co-op and you're our shareholder. You own us. You get a return on your capital stock, and the return is dependent on our performance, and our performance is dependent on our funding level. So this transition will impact our funding levels. Also, if you're an active user of the Home Loan Bank Advance products, most of you are, funding levels are important to you because that translates into your borrowing levels, your ultimate cost of funds you borrow from the Home Loan Bank. So the system has been looking at this issue for a number of years now. The system has been migrating to a floating rate issuance, migrating their floating rate issuances to SOFR index away from Libor from some time now. And now we're the largest issuer of SOFR indexed floaters out there. We've issued upwards of $270 billion on a system-wide basis of SOFR index floaters. So also the 11 home loan banks are very large users of LIBOR-based derivative hedges. So this is a big issue for us as well. Not only do we have LIBOR-based debt that spans beyond 2021, which is the phase-out time for LIBOR, we also have throughout the system and in Home Loan Bank of New York an enormous amount of LIBOR-based derivatives outstanding that span beyond 2021. So this is very important for us to stay on top of this, also to communicate with our members as well. And just before I turn it over to Ray, just want to hit upon what our members are facing with regards to LIBOR exposure. So like I had mentioned before, cost of funding. Cost of funds is dependent on LIBOR in a lot of cases, whether you're borrowing from the Home Loan Bank of New York or other funding sources. You may have deposit pricing or deposit products that are priced off of the LIBOR curve. You may offer ARMs or other floating rate loans that are linked to LIBOR. Members may be pricing their loans using competitive surveillance from the folks down the street or from other large regionals or money center banks. They may be pricing their loans off of the LIBOR curve as the basis for their pricing. So you may have that exposure, or you may have that dotted line link exposure to LIBOR, and you may not be thinking about that. Also, and then Ray will get into it a little more, some vendor contracts sometimes include default language that where remedies are based, where remedies include paying a penalty or an interest that's based on LIBOR. So some things to think about. So that's why we feel it's so important to offer this webinar today, because even though you may not think you have any significant LIBOR exposure, there may be hidden exposure that you haven't really thought about. So with that being said, Ray's going to get into the nitty-gritty of all these issues and a lot more. So let me introduce Ray Shinazuka. Ray, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom. Thanks, Adam, and I'd like to thank all of the participants for joining us today for this presentation. I've kept it kind of sparse. Hopefully, I want to keep some time for questions. So why don't we just dive in to the presentation. We'll start off with a recap of where we are today, like in June 2020. So this is the slide I like to use to sort of track everything that's been happening, and I called it halftime because 2018 really was that was the first year that SOFR appeared. That was when transactions began to appear that were based on SOFR, and the end is 2021. So that kind of puts 2020 is the beginning of 2020 was sort of the halftime point. So we're into the third quarter, and we'll talk a little bit about what some of the upcoming events are going to be, and why they how they may affect you. This is just a brief introduction. Why LIBOR is going away, why is SOFR coming into being, and the real short answer is that LIBOR was intended for one thing. It was really intended for interbank, or it was intended to measure interbank lending and to be used for loans or securities to have a common framework for that. But the problem is that the amount of interbank lending has been dropping fairly substantially over the years, and one of the features of LIBOR is that it has multiple panel members who are banks, and they submit settings for LIBOR, and as the actual transactions have dropped off, they have been relying more and more on judgment-based fixings for LIBOR, which actually we saw quite a lot of in March. During right after the Fed dropped rates, it had dropped the actual transactions to that were used to set parts of LIBOR were down to something like 2 transactions in that week. And this was recognized in, I believe it's starting in around 2014 or so. They created, in our country, we created the ARC. That was, and the ARC set out to define a replacement reference rate. After a couple of years of consideration of multiple sources, they did come up with SOFR, which is it's a measure of overnight general collateral repo. So that's repo using treasury bonds. And in this chart, you'll just sort of see that we sort of look at the difference between the LIBOR, it's based on unsecured interbank lending, where SOFR is based on overnight repo. The transaction volumes for LIBOR are something like $500 million daily. And for SOFR, it's been it's over $1 trillion, certainly in 2020. And again, LIBOR is based on a mix of actual transactions and judgment, where SOFR is 100% based on market transactions. You know, as many folks know, there was the so-called Libor Scandal that broke, gosh, about seven years ago, or something like that. And yeah, it's the misconduct. The various regulators have placed substantial fines associated with them, and there are, I think, in many cases, there's just not a lot of motivation for banks to participate in this exercise. A couple of years back, in 2018, the FCA, so that's the Financial Conduct Authority in England, they are the regulators of ICE, which is the Intercontinental Exchange. They are the administrators of LIBOR. FCA secured from the panel banks that they would stick around till the end of 2021. So rather than saying the FCA declared LIBOR illegal after that, what they really did was they sort of put it on they ensured that it would be good up to 2021, at least from the panelist perspective, the fact that you're going to have submissions. But there's also the potential that they can declare LIBOR non-representative earlier than that. So that's something that people have to keep in mind. And while we're talking about the regulatory or the official sector, is I think one of the questions that comes up is, with the lockdown and the crisis, is there going to be some allowance made for that with regard to LIBOR transition? And the response has been fairly uniform. It's really been stay the course. There have been some delays of intermediate goals, but no regulator, at least none that I'm aware of, has suggested that end of 2021 is going to move. And this includes, I've got 3 quotes. You got the ARC, the Financial Conduct Authority. Again, they are critical because really nobody can keep LIBOR alive if the FCA says it's finished. So that's just something to think about. And then of course the Fed has made a comment. And the point really is that every reason that they had to say that LIBOR had problems in its role, systemic problems, continues to be valid today, if not more so. So slide number 6, we talk a little bit about the transition date. So one of the things that's been happening over the last just over the last few months actually is there has been a shift to thinking about implementation. So the ARC, for the first time, at the end of May, they put out something called the Best Practices for Completing Transition. And for the first time, they did two things. They really put dates next to certain milestones. So as you see here, this is taken out of that report, which you can find. The link is below. For the first time, they've put dates on when they're looking to incorporate certain features like the fallbacks. When are you going to incorporate the fallbacks into your contract language? When are you going to have operational readiness for a replacement rate? And what's really critical is, for the first time, they've said these are what we recommend as your last dates to be issuing or creating LIBOR products or transactions. And the thing to know about this, and I've highlighted them in red, is that many of these are quite close. They are in 2020, and some of them are in end of June, end of September. So they're really looking. This is really here and now, I think, is the message that they want to send. And I think the other thing is the other reason is they wanted to give folks certain yardsticks to prioritize. You know, what should we be looking at? So this was in my view, it was an immensely important or significant document for transition. As I said, it's the first time that they put dates next to things. Shortly after, actually a day later, Fannie and Freddie put out their transition playbook. Fannie and Freddie, of course, plays a very large role in the mortgage business of in our country, in the United States, both in the residential and multifamily role. And their playbook put out dates pertaining to when they are, number one, they're going to cease eligibility for LIBOR products, and they've sort of broken that down by product type. But for the residential side, it's pretty much 2020 is when it goes away in terms of ARMs and as well as for securities. There are some other product types, but I think these are the sort of the important ones for I think for our purpose. And I think the real message is that they are going to work with they're working within the ARC's timeframe, but again, 2020 is a big year for many of these issues, and given their size in the market, it's I think again this is fairly significant. Just a couple slides on SOFR market growth. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the floating rate note market. As Tom hit upon, the Home Loan Bank has been a major user or major funder, issuer of SOFR floating rate notes, and that continues to the present day. But I think one of the positive points to consider is how much how much banking has picked up since I would say in 2020 it really started picking up. You can sort of see January here. You see some larger this pink area here on the top chart really picks up at that point. That's significant. I think the home loan banks and the other GSEs have an important role to prime that market, but really it's up to the banking sector to sort of fill that in. I think on the next slide I've got some. I don't expect anybody to really read that, but what's the uptake? The uptake is that there's over $700 billion of issuance. There's over 100 issuers, and more than a dozen of them have come to the market repeatedly. And you'll see also that there's quite a few that have one or two transactions. They are testing the pipes, as it were, to see the how the issuance with SOFR fares with the market. This slide is a counterpart. It's the derivatives. Looking at derivatives, it's been the growth there has been fairly steady. I think that one thing to take a look at is that everything is sort of moving in the right direction in terms of the notional amounts, the number of trades, and the tenors, as well as the SOFR fixed. In the earlier year, in the earlier months, you would see that there's a lot of SOFR Fed funds, SOFR Libor issuance, but SOFR fixed means that it's being used as a interest rate hedge, and that's ultimately where we need this market to develop. And I'll come back to this subject in a couple of slides. I have two slides here. I wanted to talk about some of the general banking concerns with Libor transition. I'll go over them really quickly, and have no doubt that somebody may bring up one of these again later on, and I certainly welcome people to do that. So these are things that I've kind of pulled out of the public record, things that have been printed, letters that have been made public. So the first one, is SOFR the one alternative index? Is that the only one that is recognized from the ARC perspective and such? Second one is that there's been this New York State legislation we've been hearing about. What is that? Is SOFR volatile? Is it did it go haywire in September 2019? And then the last two are fairly the most substantive questions that have come up, and they've been posed since the beginning. Which is, can banks use a secured rate, which is what SOFR is? It's secured. It's a risk-free or very close to a risk-free rate, unlike Libor, which has a credit component. And then the very last point talks about the operational viability of an overnight rate when people tend to when loans and securities are based on much longer frequencies or pay periods, quarterly, monthly, that sort of thing. So look, I'm not saying any of these questions there's a single right answer, but I'm trying to bring out what I think are responses to these. Again, so first one, alternative index. Every statement from the ARC has been very clear. It's voluntary. In our country, we have really, we tread. I think we tread carefully when it comes to sort of, by fiat declaring one thing must be done, particularly in this particular matter. So I think the ARC has stated it is voluntary. It's preferred alternative. And the other point that I would raise is that SOFR transactions, as I've noted, it's been over $1 trillion every day in 2020. That includes March, when there were all sorts of credit spread widening. So it's been very robust using that definition, and I think that was one of the criteria for picking SOFR. So I think that's positive. New York State legislation, again, this is, the goals are fairly, I don't think anyone's going to disagree. It's really to minimize litigation, breach of contracts that could come out of Libor cessation. There's a lot of very older dated contracts that don't talk about this. And this legislation would really apply where the contracts are silent or where they fall back to other Libor-based rates, such as use the last print of Libor, or go to your polling banks. Call up your London banks, call up your New York banks. I'm sure a lot of us have gone through these prospectuses and read that kind of documentation. And I think the other thing that's important is that certain contracts, such as securities, require unanimous consent for any kind of update, and that can be very, very challenging for many of these types of transactions, and really that was one of the intents. It was really trying to address that gap for securities and securitization. The third point: did the SOFR market go haywire in September 2019? No question. There was a big spike. There was like 200 over 280 basis points. It was a number of technical reasons: supply, demand, amount of treasury supply, banking needs of the banks to have liquidity. And I think the only observation to make is that SOFR is it's an average. It's an average regardless of how you do it. You're going to have monthly, you're going to have quarterly, and when you figure it out, that one-day spike moved moved a 90-day. If there was a coupon and it contained that date, it would have been 3 basis points higher. So I think it just puts a little perspective on that to consider. Because remember, if a Libor moves up by 10 or 20 basis points, that applies for every day in that period that's following. So it's over. Obviously it's for that one day, and that spike did correct itself. After a day or two, it was completely back to normal. Now the Fed got involved with that again, but it's just looking at the numbers. So again, we can chat about this afterwards. And again, now we move on to the secured rate. And while there's no denying that SOFR is not SOFR is much closer to a risk-free rate, tracks closer to a risk-free rate. It looks like Fed funds or very short rate treasuries. But the question is, what are the alternatives? I think that's the question I would put back, and where we as participants really need to ask ourselves is, what's the alternative to that? And I bring up just 2 points. The first of which, as I mentioned, is on the week of 3/16/2020, ICE publishes this data. Looked like there were only 2 submissions for a 3-month LIBOR. So out of 16 banks, 5 days, looks like there were only 2 submissions for LIBOR. So the rest were judgment-based. The second pertains to alternatives. Ameribor is one that has been getting some press, and what surprises is when you actually look at how that tracks, it looks an awful lot like Fed funds. So that spread over Fed funds has typically been 10 or 11 basis points, or I think the long-term average. And in March it was it was slightly over that, but certainly nothing like what Libor looked at. Libor printed. So again, and that's sort of, I'm asking a question to answer a question, and I apologize for that, but it's kind of where we are. And I think the last point is the operational viability of an overnight rate. And there's no question that is one of the big considerations that people have. It's one of the real problems for adopting the new index. But I just wanted to point out that there's something that happened in March where the New York Fed publishes now 30, 90, 180-day averages of SOFR. So they look backwards, so they tell you what SOFR, how it performed. They also have a cumulative average rate, SOFR index. So if you hear SOFR index, that could be what it means. It could also mean just regular SOFR. But what that allows people to do is to, you don't need to calculate the daily accrual per se, at least not for determining the coupon. And in fact, Freddie and Fannie in the I had mentioned earlier, they are looking at floating. They have announced that they will be using New York Fed, the 30-day averages for their floating rate bonds and ARMs. And in some cases, in the ARM cases, it's actually going to be used as a forward rate. So in other words, the last 30 days will determine the next period or next 30 days of interest. So you know, it's and there is a term that they have been talking about, but it's I would say that it's, in my view, it's still aspirational at this point. And again, it has to pass the same tests that SOFR passed, which is they got to have transactions behind them. Okay, and this is the largest part of today's presentation, because hopefully this is of interest to all of you, which is all those other slides are great, but what does this mean to me? What am I supposed to be doing? Well, the ARC has published a buy-side checklist in January, and it offered 10 points to consider, and I won't go through every one of them, but I'll just say the first two really have to do with managing your program, developing and managing a program, making sure you have the right people in place, the right leadership, as well as the resources and budgets. Communications is critical, and you really got to think about all of your stakeholders, from your customers. You got to think people like the vendors. You got to be thinking of your internal stakeholders. Also, communicating product changes and such, education, training, important. Number 4 is something we've sort of heard about. It's really you've got legacy LIBOR that you need to be able to track. This is something that will almost certainly become more of a question regulators will be asking. How much exposure do you have, and what kind of products, and what kind of maturities? So ensuring that you have the capability to do that is critical. 5 is really about the fallback, which is you have LIBOR. What happens if LIBOR goes away? So that starts with identifying all of your assets, having access to all of the agreements, and thinking about where they're going to go. And that has certainly been an important piece of what the ISDA and the ARC have been doing over the last 2 years or so. Product and portfolio strategy is about your product development and using the SOFR index for various parts of your balance sheet. And then 7, risk management. It's the usual, it's sort of their job. Identify, measure, monitor, and so on. They're also users of, they also use analytics that do depend on LIBOR in many cases that I'll touch on I think on the next slide. Operational, that I think is the operational and technology. Those are the areas that are coming to the forefront right now. And it's really, you have systems and you have processes. They have LIBOR as part of them. And again, on the next slide, I'll talk about some that, where LIBOR sort of is kind of sneaks in the back door. And 9 and 10 are accounting and reporting and taxation and regulation. Again, it's really important to engage these areas now, I think, because I think we've been talking about, most of the time up till now, we've been really trying to gather or get the momentum going, actually creating transactions and starting the trading. But at this point, I think it's really important to sort of think about when LIBOR, either when it goes away and it falls back. How does that affect? How does that affect me? It's they may not always be. I think historically or thus far they haven't been the first people that we've necessarily talked about, but I think it's increasingly important that they're part of your program. And the document is like 20 pages or thereabouts, so it's quite detailed. I really encourage people to take a look at it. Slide 17. This is a I think this was intended to describe an operational perspective. It's what is LIBOR? I think that's the question, and you sort of look at it a couple of different ways. It gets used in the enterprise a few different ways. The green, the top, it's really the contractual reference rate. And that's the most obvious one. It's used as it's an index. It's built into your products, whether floating rate notes or interest rate swaps. It is the floating standard for the floating rate leg or coupon of either of any of these instruments. In the blue area, it's this is sort of the next thing to think about. It's also a framework for relative value. As Tom hit upon, LIBOR gets used for or LIBOR or the swap curve. So swap curve is the forward expectation of LIBOR, and there's quite a lot of work that has been put together in the last 20, 25, 30 years on building a very robust interest rate and volatility models that are based on LIBOR. That's really what it's been certainly for the last 20 years or so. And the example is, I want to calculate an OAS on a fixed rate MBS. So in that situation, LIBOR is actually not part of your instrument at all, and yet it does come into the picture because when I want to generate Monte Carlo paths, forward interest rate paths, they are, in most systems, they are based on LIBOR. So this is emerging as a important thing to look at, and a lot of vendors are working on this. And the third area, down at the bottom on the right, is the LIBOR's use as a hedge accounting benchmark. Now, that does tie into the choice of your hedging instrument, but SOFR has been added as a index for hedge accounting. Right, the FASB has, they've allowed SOFR. The Fed funds is an alternative as well, but SOFR was added in the end of 2018. And on the next slide, 18, I sort of use those same breakouts, the reference rate, the framework for relative value, and the hedge accounting, to sort of thinking about breaking up some of the transition initiatives to try to organize those. And as I mentioned, so far it's really been a lot about organizing the onboarding of SOFR instruments. So finding out SOFR instruments to replace what we used to use LIBOR for. But and then the other two pieces we want to think about is what happens to the legacy LIBOR. Anything that extends beyond 2021, where is that going to go? And so these are some points to consider regarding those questions. And again, I really think the relative value is sort of the newer item that's emerging. Again, it's not based on the specific types of transactions, although there is a relationship, because all of these curves are based on liquid trading of derivatives for the most part, and that's the basis for the sort of that next phase that I think people need to consider. Just a real brief recap on again, the official sector. If you take a look at what's been printed, you'll sort of see everything kind of falls into two categories. It's either we need to offer relief, and that's sort of the top part of that quote from the ARC, which is that the regulators and self-regulatory organizations, they need to work with the market participants and really ensure that there's no inadvertent hurdles that are going to impede the development of SOFR. So the idea, and the big examples would be things like if Libor goes away, you switch over to a SOFR hedging. That ideally that wouldn't break your hedge relationships. That wouldn't force a repricing. That wouldn't, or should I say, that wouldn't force a taxable event. I would say that that's really the important thing to consider. And CFTC, there's some are a little bit more technical than others, but I think that most of them fall into the category of the relief, which is great. However, the other motivation that's emerging is really that the regulators want to see more disclosure, more action. The SEC really comes into play, and this was just a few days ago. Actually, they put out a Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations. They put out a Libor Transition Preparedness notice, and they discuss that. So that's on the SEC website if you haven't seen that or experienced that firsthand. And of course, earlier in the year, the New York Department of Financial Services, they put out a letter to see what transition plans are. I have not seen what the response. I mean, that was due in March. That was delayed, but it was due in March. I don't know if I've seen anything that's come out of that, but it's very consistent with what I think is happening. It's going to get, it's going to accelerate in 2020 and 2021. Things to think about, or things to look at for 2020 transition calendar. I think the first one is very important. This top one is they're going to be finalizing their ISDA definitions, and those are really critical because they define what the fallback for Libor is going to be for derivatives. And remember, that was like 95% of the notional size of the Libor. The Libor challenge was derivatives. So this is really critical that they've finally wrapped that up. The ARC has wrapped up something very similar with cash product, and the significance of this is potential value transfer exposure can be estimated with certainty. That can be modeled at this point because the method that's going to be used will be defined very clearly. Also, it's also the time where if there are bilateral derivatives that you may have on your book, there'll be a protocol that you can update those to the same standard as new transactions. Also in October 16 to 19, there is going to be the, some people call it the Big Bang, some people call it the single step, but the all clear derivatives will be discounted using SOFR beginning in October, and that's just a few months away here. So the CME and LCH are reaching out to directly to some clients, such as home loan banks, but also to the dealers, the FCMs. This will make a difference. There will be a market value change. There will be a risk change. They describe these in some detail, and in many cases, sort of the day by day, what's going to happen on the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, because they're going to do this. This is over a weekend, and they do have resources to allow people to take a look at what the effect will be for them. And then the other two items is in the third and fourth quarter, depending on if you are a mortgage originator or a agency MBS investor. These Freddie and Fannie's plans will have some effect on you, and it's something to take a look at going forward. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to Tom to talk about this slide. It's really the SOFR products and what role we are here to play for you. So Tom, are you on?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Ray.
Okay,
Ray,
perfect.
we're getting tight on time. I'll go through this quickly. There are a bunch of questions, so we're going to go over a little bit. Hopefully,
okay,
that's all right with the attendees. So we got a bunch of good questions from our members. So on page 21, we're up on your screen now. We do have, and we rolled out SOFR index products, floating rate products, dating back to early 2018. So we do have a straight SOFR ARC, reprices daily based on SOFR. Minimum terms are available that are 3 months out to 3 years. The Home Loan Bank, that kind of falls in line with how the Home Loan Bank system has been issuing floating rate debt. We've been issuing from 3 months out to 3 years. So we linked up our SOFR issuances with our offering. And that could change going forward as the Home Loan Bank system expands its floating rate debt offerings. So we have that. We also have the SOFR callable adjustable rate credit. They're callable in 2 ways. We have a short-term callable, which is 7 months non-call, 6 months. So it's callable when it gets to 1 month left to maturity. And then we also have a long-term option, a 3-year non-call, 2-year. So it's callable when it gets 1 year left to maturity. And those structures were designed to help out members who have liquidity hurdles or measurements that they look to achieve by keeping, number one, entities may want to keep their liabilities out of the 30-day to 0-day window. And then, so that's the short term. And then for longer term issuance of 3-year non-call 2, that's for members who may want to keep longer term funding on the balance sheet and reduce liabilities that are maturing from in the under one year term space. So that's it. Our members have been gradually utilizing these products. The operational readiness situation is changing. It's getting a little better, but there's still that hurdle. Members, this is a very unique index that reprices on a daily basis. Having the systems to accommodate this type of liability, it wasn't out there when we first rolled out this program. Gradually, members are updating their systems where they are able to accommodate this product. Also, the conventions associated with the SOFR liability is still developing. Right now, we offer a simple average calculation on this product, whereas the derivatives markets has a compounding average. So we're working towards offering a compounding average option too going forward. So if you're interested in any of these products, feel free to give us a call at any time, your relationship manager or myself. So Ray, I don't know if the next slide has much to talk about. There's a lot of reference points that you could get additional information. Are we ready to go into,
that's right.
do you want to talk about that, or you want to have a question, get into the questions?
Let's do the Q&A. That's more
All
fun.
right.
But, this is on the printed version also, so please take advantage of that. Okay,
sure.
Tom?
And hopefully we get to a large majority of these questions. But the first one, and this is something we've been hearing a lot about from a member relations standpoint. I've been hearing it. And so this question reads, how would the recent volatility or dislocation in the repo markets affect SOFR pricing, if at all?
And I would say that that's sort of the September 19. There was certainly that there was a dislocation. And again, as when you look at things over the longer term of the reset or a longer than that in terms of the derivatives market, it's certainly much more muted. I would say that over this last in March, it was really Libor that was sort of moving around quite a bit, and some of that due to true credit concerns or what, but the number of transactions again was quite sparse. So much of that was judgment based. I mean, I think it's something to. The point is something to think about. I wouldn't dismiss it, but it is something that people do want to ensure that some of the technical issues pertaining to Treasury issuance in particular, given the amount of the issuance that's been happening, it's something that the Fed certainly keeps an eye on. So hopefully it will be mitigated to some great extent based on that.
Okay, thanks, Ray. We have another question, and this reads: have you seen any discussion on how legacy agency LIBOR-based arms will be treated by the FHFA? And because these tools predate any kind of fallback language. So have you have any information on that?
Well, the playbook, the Fannie Freddie playbook, does talk a little bit about that. Generally, from my reading of the prospectuses is that Freddie and Fannie, they are the note holders to the actual loans, so they have the discretion to change those. On the loan side, the collateral side of the CMO, it's the bond side is somewhat more challenging. But the playbook does address that it's something they have to look at. It doesn't actually say what they're going to do, but it's clearly something that they are thinking about. So I think that's number one, and number two is the potential. That legislation is supposed to help clear some of that, because I think it's where that language doesn't exist is a challenge. Is potentially it's a legal challenge, and that's really what they wanted to try to fix.
Okay, Ray. Thank you. This next question is something that our members do talk about, so this is a good one. So the question is, one of our members recently was a party to an interest rate swap where it was a LIBOR-based, 3-month LIBOR-based interest rate swap for the floating leg. So what are the implications of the impact of the transition? And his question also asks if it would be wise to exit the contract and re-enter with a SOFR contract directly.
Well, that is always an option. It could potentially be complicated if it's in a hedge relationship, as an example. But the real game plan is that on the day LIBOR ceases, or on after it's declared non-representative by the FCA, that would set forth a series of events that would end up resulting, so that next reset, at the next reset, it would fall back to a SOFR, and it would fall back to SOFR plus a spread adjustment, and that spread adjustment at that time will be known, and today it's not known because it's a backward-looking rate. However, it's a 5-year median, so we can get a reasonably good idea. It's the way I would say it is that you have more than half the points already. So the structure of how that's going to happen is fairly well defined. These the definitions will sort of will cement that. And actually, I should stress that's for cleared. For bilateral, if it's uncleared, that's where both sides need to use the ISDA protocol. So ISDA does have a tool whereby counterparties can declare how they want that their legacy transactions treated, and that would allow them to bring them in line with the updated definitions, and that would certainly be best for people to go that route, because then you don't really want to have multiple sets of basis in your book where you can help it, kind of old LIBOR or new LIBOR, one goes one way, the other goes the other way. That's where ISDA is going, and I think that's going to show up maybe in the third quarter or so.
All right, so Ray, just sticking with this question, so basically, is the protocols are designed where there's not going to be any transfer of value between the two counterparties for the swap arrangement, and if it's a exchange traded swap, the exchange would be the contractual or the agent that was the calculating agent on the transaction. So if they stuck with it, most likely that there'll be no implication. So is the protocols designed to have no transfer of value, correct? It should be neutral to them.
I'll correct you, is that the protocols, it's intended on average, it should be kind of a wash. I mean, it's really intended on minimizing sort of the transfer value across all of the market participants, but there will be transfer value that everybody will be exposed to a greater or lesser degree, because the spread adjustment, as I said, it's looking for sort of that average value between SOFR and Libor, switching from one index to another. But clearly, if you have a very short or longer exposure, it's not going to be perfect, because it's one spread for any tenor, whether it's like a 5-year, 10-year, whatever. It's going to be that same number. So there's going to be some exchange of value, which is why it's important to sort of understand what those changes are today or as soon as possible.
And if you're a party to a swap transaction, I guess you could always call your the swap dealer and say, let's flip this to SOFR, and then it'll give you a price right out of the gate. So if you're concerned about the transfer price, you could just go that route as well, I guess.
Correct. Yes.
Right.
Yes. And certainly, kind of monetize it now or later. Yes. So if you want the certainty, or you want to do it over time, that's always a possibility. Sure.
Ray, last question. So this is something you and I have been talking about. There's been one of the members saw some recent articles about the coronavirus potentially delaying the transition, and then some people are saying maybe Libor isn't that bad. So is there a potential that this could be extended, and then also that Libor could potentially be lingering around for a while? So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, let me answer the second part of that. So Libor lingering around. That is, I think the FCA, they've specifically talked about sort of the, that's what they call about non-representativeness. So the idea that Libor could exist as some sort of a rate, but it's, it doesn't, it may not be based on a robust methodology of how you get there. I mean, that would kind of fall into, it's not representative as an interest rate. And I think the FCA would sort of blow the whistle at that point and just say, guys, we have to switch over. So there was a lot of concern about that quite early on, from 2018 or so. And really what we call the pre-cessation triggers are really intended to deal with that, because that's not something that people want to have to worry about. In terms of it lingering, or I'm sorry, in terms of delaying the cessation, I would just say that, look, these guys have been pretty vocal. I think the official sector, they've been fairly vocal that they're continuing to hold on to the most of these original timelines. And the other point I would stress is that FCA has been probably the most vocal about it. So that's in England, but they're really important, because they are the only regulator who can directly tell the Libor administrator what to do. So if they pull the plug, there's really not much in this country people can do to sort of say, you got a Libor contract and it's gone. You're sort of in a very tough place. So I would suggest that it's not really up to the Fed or the ARC or anybody to move the data around. It's really based on what the FCA is going to do. They're pretty. They've been reinforcing that end of 2021 date. I really believe that they're quite serious. I think that's the date that we should all have in our mind as the date.
Okay, Ray. Well, that wraps it up. Thanks a lot, Ray. Appreciate it. It was great information as usual. And I wanted to reiterate or mention to members, if you ever wanted to have Ray speak to your organization, whether it be your management team or your board, I'd be happy to do that. So you can just arrange that through your relationship manager. Well, thanks again, Ray. I just wanted to mention next week we are not having a webinar, so that's leading to the 4th of July weekend. Hope everyone has a great holiday weekend. Our next session is July 9th, and that's with Tom Parliament, as Adam had mentioned, and he's going to be discussing loan pricing and dynamics of loan pricing during these unprecedented times here during the COVID crisis. So that should be very interesting. And then 2 weeks from then, on July 23rd, Janet Lockwood, who works with Tom Parliament Consulting, will be discussing deposit pricing strategies to optimize your liability side of your balance sheet during this crisis. So she has had a great experience doing that in the prior crisis, and she has some great ideas on what you should be thinking about in this current environment. So again, thank you. I'm sorry we went over a little bit, but we'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a great holiday weekend, everybody.
Okay, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. So that concludes our session for today.